emergency for the first time in America.
This is Jim, and
receiving this message. We are Ken Jennings and John Roderick. We speak to you from our present, which we can only assume is your distant past, the turbulent time that was the early 21st century.
Fearing the great cataclysm that will surely befall our civilization, we began this monumental reference of strange and obscure human knowledge. These recordings represent our attempt to compile and preserve wonders and esoterica that would otherwise be lost.
So whether you're listening from an advanced civilization or have just reinvented the technology to decrypt our transmissions, this is our legacy to you.
This is our time capsule. This is the Omnibus.
You have accessed entry 088.EZ2736, certificate number 26524. The Baader-Meinhof Gang.
Verhandlung wird in Abwesenheit der Angeklagten fortgesetzt. Begründung, die Angeklagten sind...
Keine Stellungnahme gehabt, du Schwein!
Wird jetzt in der Begründung fortfahren.
Ganz klar, dass Sie jetzt hier mit äußerster Brutalität vorgehen müssen!
So we're living in a time that feels in some ways like an unprecedented sort of rebellion, a rising up of a kind of, you wouldn't describe it as a united left, but certainly in the last...
But an actual activated left is new in my lifetime.
That's right. Up until the last 6 years, probably, the left had become a kind of muted and co-opted, like, conservative middle that from the Clinton years on, and arguably all through the Reagan years, in an attempt to kind of be bipartisan, adopted a pretty conservative economic program, embraced globalization, and embraced kind of corporate deregulation and deregulation of the stock market.
And sought to kind of expand the appeal of the party by seeking an ideological and social centrism as well.
Right. Whilst the right in American politics...
What's the other thing?
...had no interest in compromise at all and continued to just push more and more rightward, resulting in an American political spectrum that didn't really have a mainstream left to speak of, and certainly not an active and engaged radical left, or rather what I guess you would call far left, that offered any kind of mainstream critique of capitalism in general and mainstream sort of counter to the idea that corporate capitalism in particular was going to be the kind of, it was generally accepted as the solution to social inequality. It was the solution to, and based on the idea that growth could be infinite, right? That money would grow infinitely, that resources would never be exploited, and if they were, technology would magically wave its hands and solve problems.
But you've got inequality, one result there. The environmental cost, that's
right.
Something that the left should have been grappling with.
And but the left was very siloed. It was hard, environmentalists were one thing and social justice activists were another, but there wasn't, and I think you could make a case, still isn't a common cause, a common platform, because the left right now at least is in a state where ideological purity kind of becomes it becomes an impediment to developing like a consistent far left platform.
And you'd want a national party to do that. And in a parliamentary system, there would be room for that.
Right.
But, according to one popular formulation, the United States is now left with essentially two corporatist parties of fairly similar ideology, one pro-choice and one pro-life. And that's what you vote between. And
the Democratic Party has always been a party that tried to include social justice in their platform, where the right didn't. But it was social justice within a context of not a police state exactly, but a law and order state
within the system.
Yeah, there was not a sense that within the Democratic platform that the police or law enforcement in general was something that Democrats would ever tilt against. And far left platforms typically see the police as instruments of a capitalist order, there to impose, property rights, or not impose, but there to protect property rights, protect, corporate interests against what would be considered basic human rights.
There's a funny dynamic going on right now in summer 2020, where you and I are temporarily, where you've got, in the run-up to the election, you've got the Republican candidates and their surrogates trying to make this case that Joe Biden, of all people, wants to defund the police.
Yeah, I know.
And you've got people on the left just thinking, man, I wish. Imagine hearing the Republican platform and being like, yeah, boy, that would be great.
Yeah.
Is that true? I'll vote for that.
It's unfortunately not true.
Unfortunately, he's a 108-year-old Irish-American man who does not want to defund the police.
Well, and who's been a Democratic Party operative since the 70s and embraces a great society kind of idea about the way the American left is going to produce a more equitable society.
But you see the limitations of starting the conversation you see this in multiple arenas of it. Problem of starting the conversation from the center,
right,
and letting your position be pushed rightward. Something that hasn't troubled the Republicans recently. You kind of yearn for some kind of presence in government that says, no, we want to overhaul the tax system because we want to pay for this Green New Deal, and negotiates from there, not for, here's Nancy Pelosi's watered down version of this, where you get a few tax credits for your healthcare deductible.
But she's starting from a position that even in the Johnson administration would have been considered a center-right place
or
to
in any other nation on earth, which must be confusing to people watching American politics from afar, thinking, this is neither party, including your vilified left-wing one, believes in the public option for health insurance?
Right.
Come on.
Well, and what I think is interesting about our current moment, right, is that the left is beginning to galvanize, and it's galvanizing around racial injustice in the present, September of 2020, and a lot of that is bolstered by a longstanding project to kind of reevaluate the American experiment in context of its the fact that the American experiment was inextricable from institutionalized slavery from the mid 17th century to abolishing slavery, and then another 100 years of sort of institutionalized racism. So that process of reevaluation, contextualized by police violence, which is now available for all to see.
This is largely technology driven.
Right.
Problems that have always existed are now harder to sweep under the rug.
And just as you were saying about the international community going, what, the left isn't even aware of what is considered mainstream leftism? The black community in the United States is like, this is news to you? And that conversation now has become...
And it was kind of news to me. I feel like over the last 10 years, I've become aware of things that, have been deeply ingrained in the American culture of black folks for my entire life. I didn't know that you had to take your son aside and tell them exactly how to act in a traffic stop so you didn't get killed. And that this was kind of a rite of passage unfortunately, for black kids. This was something I never thought about because I never had to think about it. And now I feel like these things are in the popular discourse in a way that they, were not even for well-meaning folks on the left 10 years ago.
It's true. And when you think about it, of course it's been true the whole time, right? When the scales fall from your eyes.
This is not a newly urgent problem for anyone, but people who have recently been introduced to it.
And it's true. It's true of.
It's always been urgent.
It's always been urgent, and it's always been. I think that we have seen a tremendous change in the way that the law regards, and by the law I mean the laws, regard institutionalized discrimination. But what changing the laws cannot do is uproot long-standing racism in communities, racism in the institutional memory of all these places that maybe have new laws that govern them, but have mores and traditions that are somewhat impenetrable to law.
And the new laws may actually galvanize and embolden kind of resistance to them.
Right.
Like now it's not just soft media pressure to be
a better person.
Yeah, to be a nice, tolerant person. Now there's teeth that make your small business be tolerant in certain legal ways and make election officers act in certain legal ways. And
what that means is that you have all these case examples where if you felt like the moray or the tradition was closer to the truth, the laws would feel imposed upon you by a radical.
It gives you the option of feeling like a victim,
right?
Even though in general those people tend to be the ones exercising unexamined privilege, not a real underclass in any way.
Right. Well, but that's the thing about American politics. If you look at absolutely any political interest group across the entire spectrum, what you will find is that now, in the current conversation, every one of them posits themselves as a victim class, including white Christians, including
the biggest companies in America.
Right, like the boards of directors.
Right.
If you listen to their language and you look at their platform, you see that they are using the language of victimization and in a way using the language of a Marxist dialectic. This is
like when my teenager, has internalized the modern language of therapy speak enough to tell me that it's a toxic energy when I tell her to clean her room. You know,
and the wonderful thing about the Marxist sort of like bicameral understanding of power, not just global power, but as Marxism became less a critique of 19th century power in the hands of manufacturers and became more of a general social critique that was more of a blueprint that you could sort of apply to any exchange, because any exchange between even two people is infused with a power dynamic
or a potassium dynamic
or a brown banana.
In any situation, somebody has more potassium in their system right now than the other person.
The power of the banana. You can look at it as an owner-worker dichotomy, right, or conflict, and so you can see yourself as you can put yourself in the role of the exploited worker, even if you are not in the least bit exploited, or because the dynamic is so fluid.
We definitely. This is something I saw this week: people going on TV in front of an audience of tens of millions of people to share their shattering story of how they were canceled.
Yeah, I know. It's really terrible.
You're speaking to 15 million people, sir. You were not, in fact, canceled.
Here you are, still with a platform. But what's interesting about, I think, the contemporary left is they have there is a tenor or a temperature to the conversation that suggests that there's not a real institutional memory of leftism. Not just in the United States, but in the Western world. It seems like because of that long interregnum, and that's a word we love on the show.
We love it so much we add a syllable to
it. But the period between the late 70s or the early 80s and recent years.
A full invisible generation, us, came of age.
That's right. And during that period, leftism had become far leftism had become somewhat muted and disorganized. And it was partly because the right made a concentrate, the right and even the Democratic Party made a kind of concentrated effort to mute that generation. And the end of the Cold War took a lot of the energy out of what was seen as a global kind of left-right conflict, and left us in this world where there was not a Marxist other to either emulate or use as an example of the enemy.
I wonder if that's why my parents' generation, you see them thinking and voting in different ways than ours does, in ways that appear to me troublesome, is because that's the last generation that has some memory of an energized left that was scary and violent.
Right.
Because our generation has never come up with, in our generation, all those threats in reality or in thriller movies come from the right.
Right. The right, who are the fascistic ones, are the violent ones.
The fertilizer bombs. We don't really have a memory of that kind of, at least in this country, that kind of violence coming from the left.
And there was the rise of the environmental movement, and especially in the 1980s and early 90s, there were some terroristic acts where largely it was pouring sand in the gas tanks of bulldozers.
If the victim is a bulldozer.
But every once in a while, I think here at the University of Washington, there was the famous incident where they burned down the greenhouse at the horticultural center because they suspected that there were GMO products there. Mm-hmm. And, what they really did was just kill a bunch of orchids. But it was seen as a leftist attack. There were animal rights events too.
But if you remember the 60s, these were the headlines every day. What the scary campus kids are going to do next. And that just doesn't exist anymore. So in so much that we have to invent it, that we have to imagine that Bernie bros are a threat because they were mean to Maureen Dowd yesterday or something.
Yeah. But within the left, I think there is not a sense that there is precedent for this experience, or there's precedent for the movement. So
the movement, you think, should have a longer memory?
Just in that there's a lot of source material that can be used, I think, to clarify a wider position, but also some cautionary tales in terms of what not to do next time. What not to do next time, and what and what to do to I think build on structures that you're making, and not have a platform that's reactionary, right? That is only against the right, rather than being constructive and have a platform to build a world. And that's a problem with any kind of reactionary group.
Common critique of
that you don't actually have an idea, a better idea in the chamber. You're just angry.
And those are the images that you see on TV. You don't see the angry people, hitting 10 bureaucratic brick walls before some element of them finally starts breaking windows.
Right. And the anger, just the simmering anger in the black middle class, where it's like, look, you have no idea. It's not just that we get shot at traffic stops.
Like, someone literally had to make these things a plot device on Blackish for me to understand them, because they do not make the news.
Right. But institutionally, just every time you go to an office and try and appeal to somebody, every time you go to a bank and look for a loan, right? It's just, it's a systemic thing. But it's not just anger. It is, even within political structures, if all of your platforms are just platforms to undo a precedent, right? It's not actually...
It limits the actual good your movement will do,
yeah,
right?
It's not constructive.
You're going to hit a stopping point at some point.
But the 1960s and 70s were a period where in the Western world, and really globally, leftism was there was a very active, very frustrated, and global hard left that was organized across the globe, loosely organized in a lot of ways, and convinced at the time that power structures as they existed were not surmountable by reason or by political means.
What are the inputs that are making them feel this way? Like, what do they feel are the crises? Have they just learned an academic language to be angry young people, or specific things happening in the world that they feel energized about?
In the immediate post-World War II political world, you had a lot of things happening, and one of them was that colonialism was dissolving, was collapsing all around the world. All of the kind of former colonial possessions in Africa, in the Asian subcontinent.
But that should be good news for them.
Well, but what was happening was that Western powers, and by that I include the Soviet Union, were, although colonialism was technically over,
The viceroy went home.
right? The new governments,
The CEOs moved in.
and also the CIA and the KGB moved in, and these newly formed nations, which had an initial opportunity to become either democratic states or
Workers' paradises.
Let's say, or to just reinstitute a kind of local tribalistic government to become not just states but nations. Those opportunities were immediately kind of seized upon by the quiet the tendrils of the Cold War, the initial years of the Cold War, and these nations,
and the economic power, not just the strategic power against the other bloc, but also
the American Fruit Company.
The economic losses you'd get if just because this country is not the same color on the map as me anymore doesn't mean I don't need my bananas and my petroleum and all the rest.
That's right, and even and not just the pre-existing ones, but the new opportunity to go into places with unstable governments and exploit mineral resources. This is also when oil was discovered in the Middle East, and when the world became truly an oil economy. So that was happening, but also part of why World War II ended and we had a kind of a Pax Americana for the rest of the 20th century was that, unlike the end of World War I and prior wars, the victors did not impose too onerous a burden upon the losers. I mean, beyond having had their countries utterly destroyed
right.
and everyone living in the rubble.
But it would be nice to think that was learning from the mistakes of World War I, but realistically, it might just be more the realpolitik of we need to make nice with our former enemies because there's a bigger enemy now, either the Soviets or, for the Soviets, the us.
Right, and both things can be true, right? There was idealism active in the West at the time and in the U.S. State Department and in the universities, the idea that after World War I, we saw what happens when you
humiliate
an enemy. But also, you're absolutely right. World War II ended and the Cold War began
the same day.
And so the denazification.
They don't show that, by the way, in Times Square when the sailor's kissing the nurse, and then immediately somebody's like, extra, break it up, Cold War begins. And the nurse is like, oh man, but we were going to make out for a day.
Yeah, she gets home to her apartment and there are 3 other people living there. The denazification and in a way the dissolution of Imperial Japan, all and the fascisticization of
that's right.
Italy. Those processes were kind of skin deep. I mean, there was a long period where real bad Nazis were brought to trial, but a lot of the sort of mid-level, just regular old SS and Nazi functionaries.
It's a logistical problem. There's just too many of them, right?
That's right.
And you'd cripple the country. You'd get rid of anybody who knew how to do anything.
They spent a little bit of time in a re-education camp, and then they went back home, and within hours were, not just back to work, but back to work in local government. A man by the name of Hans Martin Schiller was, or Schleyer.
I love Schleyer.
Was they're one of the best speed metal bands.
I like Stryper and I like Schleyer.
Schleyer. He got out of his re-education camp in 1948, and within a few hours was, or not a few hours, but within a few.
He's hoisting beer steins with his fellow Bavarian provincial council folks.
But within a year's time was a member of the Bremen City Council, and began an illustrious political career. So by the 1960s, you saw in Western Europe, especially in Italy and in Germany, a lot of the mid-level people in politics, the mayors of towns, the members of parliament, and the industrial leaders all had direct Nazi experience. They were the generation that were Nazis. And
does that mean, if you were voting for whatever the conservative party was in Germany in 1960, then at least at a local level, a lot of those would be
at a national level.
Oh.
There was just not there was not yet a German sort of national reckoning.
There was no sense that if a guy has a monocle, you shouldn't vote for him.
A monocle and a tiny little mustache and a fencing scar. No, those guys were in charge. No, it was the younger guys with the fleshy faces and the kind of dead eyes, I think, that were ascendant. But what you saw was a kind of conservatism in German politics that was also a product of being right in the center of the Cold War. Germany was the bulwark against an Eastern invasion. Germany was the centerpiece of NATO. Germany was occupied by American and British and French troops. Germany was divided, and Berlin was a divided city right in the heart of it. So the kind of conservatism that former Nazis just naturally gravitated toward really filled a role in geopolitics.
They would have been dedicated anti-communists in 1939, and they're just going to do it again in 1959.
That's right, except dedicated anti-communism now divorced from genocidal racism and like an insatiable desire for conquer, and
at least they've sublimated those things.
They've sublimated them, and and Germany became a model liberal democracy, but liberal in the sense of
voting.
Yeah, right, and center right thinking.
Yeah,
as a counter to Marxist. The Soviet Marxism and Eastern, the Eastern Bloc,
just across the river,
which was left political ideology, but of course also fascistic,
a repressive regime as well.
Yeah, and that was where this confusion, or I guess a longstanding confusion of how you can have a right-wing political structure that sees itself as working more in their interests than a political ideology that expressly speaks for workers.
Except they're all poor and have one pair of overalls and are living in the shabbiest possible apartments and don't have a can opener.
Right. And that really fed into what became a mid-century commodity fetishization, which was to say that that as a worker, you're an emblem of your freedom was this shiny toaster or this brand new car. And commodities, which were produced and sold in this increasingly frenzy of manufacturing and selling in particular, were tied to ideas of personal liberation and cultural liberation.
Boy, are we still dealing with echoes of that today, where even your average American citizen, far away from any geographically and temporally far away from any threat of the Reds, still interprets our constitutional freedom as you can't make me wear a mask in a Walmart.
Right.
You can't shut down the Chuck E. Cheese.
You can't tell me that I can't drive a car that pollutes.
Right. Like our understanding of our freedom is entirely linked to the symbols of consumerism.
Right. And that fetishizing of products and commodity was a very academic critique of Western capitalism as sort of posited as the opposite of Marxist-Leninism or cooperativism, any kind, socialism of any kind.
It's going to lead to that dreary totalitarianism you see 100 miles east of here.
Right. And so this was happening, this critique was fairly universal in the universities, and a version of it came to be called it came to be known as situationism. And situationists were in a way almost a caricature of a kind of leftist academic, because they also brought into this economic critique a kind of influence of surrealism, a sense of...
They're postmodernists?
They're the classic postmodernists who are saying it's not just a question of the rights of the workers, but it's more of a theoretical framework of how we live and think, how the soul best manifests.
There's an aesthetic.
That's right.
It's about a vibe. My revolution is a vibe.
And so all of this was within the student movements of the 1960s, a sense that the re-Nazification of the German and Middle Europe kind of political world meant that fascism had not been rooted out, and it meant that government was incapable of being reformed from within. You couldn't just vote in leftist candidates because all the power structures remained and had been reinforced, renamed, recolored, so that really fascism was the form of government.
Yeah, if you feel that consumerism is tainted, you feel like the whole basis of the economy is tainted.
Right.
And what do you do then? Like, there's really no. What can you do within that economy? Nothing. Like your only recourse is going to be to some kind of external revolt.
And this is happening in an era in the mid-60s in particular, not yet quite the era where protests had become mainstream.
Interesting.
We'd seen in the 50s a lot of resistance in the United States on the part of civil rights, marchers and the civil rights movement, the civil rights battles in the South.
And to this day, we associate that with struggle on the left, with a certain blueprint of protest.
And it was a blueprint for the global left to see this kind of active resistance, and it came. Martin Luther King was directly influenced by Gandhi.
It's strikes and marches, and it's all Gandhi's playbook.
Sit downs. So that became a kind of an idea, I guess, within the left that there was a way to shut it down, and maybe you couldn't fight it from inside, but you could shut it down.
Stop the gears.
Only a few steps from shutting it down, to actively destroying it. The mid-60s are also...
If you shut it down, it can start up again. If you blow it up,
that's right.
Maybe it can't.
You can rebuild a different thing. This was also a time, the mid-60s was, and we've talked about it on the Omnibus before, after the advent of the birth control pill, you had sexual liberation sweeping the world. Sex was no longer tied to just procreation within marriage. You had all of the third world struggles at the end of colonialization, where it was apparent that revolutionary movements, democratic movements were not thriving, and it was clear that it was because of CIA and KGB intervention.
It's not in the West's interest to have those movements thrive in these places.
Right. And so there's all this arms trading, all these coups d'etat, guerrillas kind of resisting the democratically chosen government, heads of state mysteriously dying or being abducted. And all of that's, in the newspapers. It's not, people are not failing to notice.
This is not the secret history of the 20th century.
It's also the rise of the baby boomer youth identity. Also, women's liberation is happening. There's now a decade of racist action kind of globally. The Soviet Union, by the way, was describing itself as the antidote to all these Western problems throughout. And
does the left buy it in Europe and elsewhere?
It's very hard to be enamored by Marxism as a theory and not have to wrestle with nations that are describing themselves as Marxist in practice. And a lot of what happened was when the Soviet Union started to fall out of favor in the academic left. Well,
Stalin.
You had Maoism. You had a Chinese model that had also divorced itself from the Soviets and became, the teachings of Mao. We didn't yet in the West know about the millions of dead in the in the famines and in the backyard smelters of the Maoist regime. So there were a lot of Marxist models that would enable you to kind of do that in a way.
You still do it today.
Yeah,
you still kind of are trying to thread the needle where, well, if you believe that there are progressive or social democratic innovations that will work in your country, you still say, well, there's a way to do that without falling into their trap.
Well, and we've heard it our whole lives, right? That, well, the Soviet Union wasn't really Marxist; it was fascist, and there's never been a Marxist nation. And
it's funny because the right will do the same thing. The National Socialists were not really fascists,
right?
Hitler was a left winger,
and that I think that sort of self-lobotomizing, where you're able to see the potential of a theory and ignore having to wrestle with
not this time
all the difficulty in implementing it. But you also have all the liberation theologies of the globe, right? You have all these different peoples, particularly ones living in nations that had borders imposed by Balfour, realizing that, oh wait, we're the Kurds, we're not half Iraqi, half Turkish. And then you also have the bugbear of the world, Israel, right in the center of the Middle East, galvanizing a kind of Arab identity movement, and very problematically being at the heart of centuries of anti-Semitism, now having forged a nation in the cauldron of that, a nation which immediately is posited as a kind of fascist colonial power within the Muslim world.
They hardly got to enjoy any time of not being the persecuted underdog.
There was zero time, right? Before Israel was even founded, the Jews emigrating to the Middle East were already colonial usurpers. And that dynamic, the Palestinian fight against the Israelis, became a leftist cause célèbre because a lot of American Jews that were funding Israel and the American sort of CIA project to have Israel as a bulwark against, because a lot of the Arab states were funded by the Soviets. It became a Cold War hotspot.
But still, if I was a German kid, I would stay away from that one.
Sure.
If I was a German college student looking for a part of the world, like pick Cambodia or something, my friend. I know. Like maybe Israel's one you want to just stay away from. I get it, but
Unfortunately, that's not how it went down.
That is not how it went down. And I assume we can talk about there might be some lingering anti-Semitism on both sides there, right? I mean, anti-Semitism is not solely a problem of the right during this time.
Unfortunately, anti-Semitism is the thing that brings people together.
It doesn't. It should. It could.
Anti-Semitism could bring people together, but it tends to work the other way.
Yeah.
What happened is, by 1968, this all came to a head in protests that happened globally, right? 1968 was when the students of Paris rose up. It was when the people of Czechoslovakia rebelled.
So there's also anti-communism
in
the liberal liberation theology of the year.
It really felt like, protests against Vietnam and the fact that a lot of these NATO nations were tacit supporters of the Vietnam War, if not active ones. The West German government contributed a lot to that conflict, and to, they were sending arms globally as part of the, as their side of the Cold War. The recognition that that these student populations, and at that point in time, the baby boom was at its crest. The majority of that generation, an enormous generation, were all in their late teens and early 20s, and very activated by the academic Marxism, but also a brand new environmental movement, and a recognition that global war wasn't necessarily the best, anti-nuclear protests.
Yeah, I guess the shadow of just your death every day from the threat of nuclear arms has got to be a big part of that.
But also a sense within this situationist mentality that that the antidote to commodity fetishization and global capitalism was not something that you needed to undertake as from the point of a nation state, but that you could start to live communally. This was an era when people were tuning in and dropping out and living together in squats, refusing to pay rent, moving out to the countryside. Unfortunately, then as now, a lot of the most vocal people in these movements were middle to upper middle class educated whites, right? A lot of workers.
You got to be able to afford the college tuition to learn about situationism.
Yeah, and there is an intrinsic privilege in being able to sit within systems of power and resist them, right? Because if you're talking about unionizing the hotel workers in the United States and giving them a voice, that's a ton of work. But if you're the son of a state senator and can sit crisscross applesauce.
All these lefty kids are lazy dilettantes, John. I get it.
But as we'll see, a lot of the leftist movements in Europe at the time and in the United States were spearheaded by these people, and I think
they've got the free time for it.
And now we recognize that, and it's a fairly recent. Widespread critique. It's always been a critique. In particular, in the feminist movement, there was an early understanding that the feminist movement means something very different to white middle class women than it does to women of color and working class women. Mm-hmm. And you often find that those two groups do not have a common cause when looking for political representation. And we see that now. That critique is often made like, please, white middle-class people, do not try to speak for Black Lives Matter, for instance. We need to foreground the voices of people that are actually affected by this.
The assumption being not just that it's a bad look, but that they understand the issues better.
They understand the issues better, but also it's a form of just sort of, everlasting colonialism if the speakers are always white. In the 60s, that was not yet common understanding. And in 1968, the potential of this global uprising, and you see it in the American story too, all of the Berkeley protests.
The SDS. And
right, Students for a Democratic Society, the Weathermen, all of those protests were part of this global uprising, and it really felt like a moment where anything was possible. And what ended up happening was a universal police crackdown. This was the Democratic Convention, the Chicago cops. This was the cops in Paris, and in Germany especially, the neo-fascists that were running the country really brought the police crackdown hard on students. And in particular, there was a protest in 1968 when the Shah of Iran visited West Germany.
He was living in exile wherever they exiled him?
In 1968, he was still the Shah of Iran.
Oh.
And I guess this would have been in July of 1967. The Shah was visiting, and the leftist students of Germany were protesting his visit. And a policeman killed a protester by the name of Benno Ohnesorg. Yeah, Ohnesorg. Benno Ohnesorg.
Benno, huh?
Benno. Shot him. A cop shot him in the head, and it turned out the cop actually had a Nazi past, but also at the end of it was working for the Stasi, who were the East German secret police.
Oh. Well, I mean, today you would not be surprised by the twist of the police having white supremacist ties, but working for the Stasi is we don't get that anymore.
Well, right, and that didn't come out immediately, and it's not clear whether the Stasi were
trying to destabilize
it. But it began a series of sort of student rebellions, and all of this is happening within an environment where the German or the West German press is really, really dominated by kind of a Rupert Murdoch figure that owns the vast majority of Western media, German media.
West German media.
His name was Axel Springer, and Springer became basically the watchword of a conservative and repressive media.
So he's the villain for these youth movements.
Yeah, and making it impossible for the true story to get out. In 1972, a student by the name of Andreas Baader and a couple of friends firebombed a couple of department stores. And this was a kind of, I guess what you would think of maybe as a typical student situationist understanding of what an effective protest would be against police brutality and widespread fascism.
Just because the free market is
yeah, you see it during the WTO protests and during a lot of the Black Lives Matter protests that the anger gets taken out on the Nike store or the commercial enterprise because they are the public face.
They have a street facing presence.
Yeah, and they are commodity fetishization at its face, mm-hmm. Right? That's where you buy the shiny toaster.
Oh yeah, I'm in favor of it.
Yeah,
I'll blow up an Apple store.
Blow them up. I mean, that's what. And while you're blowing it up, loot it. But Baader burned down a couple of Kaufhaus department stores in reaction to all these events, and kind of set about set himself up as a student, part of a student rebellion. And there were student rebel groups springing up throughout Italy and Germany and kind of throughout the West. I mentioned the Weathermen in the United States. There were groups called the Revolutionary Cells. There were the Red Brigades in Italy.
Yeah, if you were a person of that generation, you would have friends just on the run from the cops.
That's right. There was the 2 June movement. It was part of being a young college student for a lot of people.
It really was. That's what I learned in those Elena Ferrante books is that, everybody had that one friend who just dropped out of sight and then the cops started asking you where you'd seen them last.
Yeah, if you went into any leftist bookstore, you could presume that the person in John Lennon glasses behind the counter was also in the evenings plotting to burn down a grocery store. And they were all linked, but also they had shared goals and shared ideologies up to a certain point, but some of them were anarchistic, some of them were openly Marxist-Leninist. I mean, there was a lot of kind of dispute about what the actual end goal was in overturning the fascist global state, but the short-term goals were shared, and unfortunately for Baader and his crew were arrested and put in jail, and then were released. And the initially escaped from jail.
Ooh.
And escaped from jail with the help of a young journalist by the name of Ulrike Meinhof. And she was...
I didn't realize Baader-Meinhof was also maybe a relationship and not just an organization.
Well, it's hard
Do sparks fly?
It's hard to say how much their popularity or how much this movement was maybe partially glamorized, because they were beautiful people.
Oh, that's funny.
And a lot of these young students, and you see this in the SDS, you see this in a lot of student movements, they're gorgeous and they're in their early 20s and they feel very passionately about the cause. And so when you see them represented in the media, they're just tailor-made to be celebrities. And they were conscious of this, and their whole cadre were all young, educated, and pretty. They went on the lam. They started robbing banks, and then eventually were arrested. The challenge for the West German state was that because of their celebrity, but also because of, I think, a recognition that a lot of their critiques of German society were accurate, or at least compelling, there was a lot of sympathy for these leftist revolutionary movements in the general population.
Yeah, people love an outlaw, right?
Yeah, that's right. And the connection with Bonnie and Clyde was explicit.
Oh.
The Bonnie and Clyde movie had been a huge success during this same time period.
67, I think.
And Baader and Meinhof actually spoke of themselves as the Bonnie and Clyde of Germany at the time. And it's a strained connection, because Bonnie and Clyde were not trying to bring about they weren't trying to overturn the capitalist system.
The whole Bonnie and Clyde fascination is weird, because there's really nothing that Robin Hood-like about them.
No.
It's just that if you're very poor, you like to see rich people blow up.
Yeah, they're pretty terrible, but Bonnie looked good in those flowered dresses, I guess.
Like beret.
So over a quarter of the West German population expressed sympathy for the aims of Baader and Meinhof. And what they were up against was the public prosecutors, the judges, the entire legal system. When you met those people and read their biographies, you realize they were all Nazis. Every one of them had some terrible backstory.
It's very tricky for the movie of this. They're going to have to, if you want to have a crusading prosecutor, you're going to have to leave something out.
And so the right was not only unsympathetic because they were
Old and square, and running guns and part of an anti-liberation global cabal, but they were also actually Nazis. They have to be the villain in the movie by law.
And so they did what you would expect, which was actually pass laws against protesting, pass laws against these people specifically. During the trials, they would exclude the media.
Oh, that's interesting.
They would. The trials were really stacked against them. When the Baader-Meinhof gang was sent to prison at Stromheim, they actually built a new section of the prison just to hold them, where each one of them was kept in complete isolation.
They were afraid a movement would grow behind bars.
The problem with what happened to the movement was that as they got imprisoned, they kind of, because the Baader-Meinhof gang actually went to Palestine and Libya and trained with the PLO. And this was that time when the IRA, ETA in northern Spain,
that have shared camps, right?
Yeah, the PLO, these groups all saw that they were part of a larger movement, a liberation movement. And so they trained and they used similar tactics, but they also kind of shared one another's goals, right? If you were in the Baader-Meinhof gang, you also wanted Ireland for the Irish. Mm-hmm. and as you mentioned, like problematically, were against.
You had a problem with Jews.
You had a problem with Jews.
Whether, whatever your justifications were. That does seem like it's not a super complicated view of the world. I guess I would say if they're immediately seeing, one thing about immediately seeing your side of all these very diverse struggles is that you probably don't understand the subtleties of the struggle very well. It's a tendency to see a villain everywhere.
Right. And also a tendency to maybe overestimate the degree to which the silent majority will take up your banner once a certain threshold is crossed. And you see this with the Boogaloo movement now, or the far right imagines that all they have to do is spark this race war or spark this uprising, and it will galvanize all these moms and dads who are just sitting around watching television. They're all going to stand up and say, "Yeah, we support your plan to have a white state in Idaho, Montana, and Nevada. We support the idea."
We've just been too shy to say so.
And it's also true of the left, in that this idea that there's a nascent desire for revolution, and what needs to happen is just a line of, and I think right now on the left, at least, it's the same as it was in 72, which is that the fascism will become so overbearing that it inspires a revolutionary instinct, I guess, in the populace.
The right was correct that there was this unsuspected silent majority for a political revolution, at least. No one thought the Tea Party was the seeds of an actual presidential run.
Right.
And I guess that could be, I think that has the potential to be true on the left as well, when you see how well, certain kinds of New Deal kind of progressivism ideas are polling in healthcare and social justice, income inequality. You can probably put a political revolution on the back of that stuff, but I don't think anybody's going to want to see
fighting in the streets,
chairs going through windows.
And the crucial difference is that the right-wing ideologies in the United States right now do not really have an economic component beyond just let things be the way they are. In that sense, they are very reactionary against change. Most of the appeal to the voters in 2016 that brought Trump to office were, as you mentioned before, reactionary against laws that they perceived to be imposing on their natural right to not make birthday cakes for gay people, or disinclude people from their clubs, or ultimately, I think it's all a reaction to affirmative action. The feeling that the state...
Just a sense deep down, maybe, that your color of skin is getting replaced. Is that the basis of all of it in America? The demographic sense that, somebody sensing their own extinction?
Or feeling that what used to be fair...
Yeah.
Which they...
In other words, easy for me.
Yeah, which they didn't see... They had no exposure to the unfairness. Yeah. What used to be fair is now becoming unfair.
Stacked against me.
And that's a basic need. And the problem with the leftist arguments is that they're always more sophisticated. All the things that you just described, and particularly the hard left, to overturn the structures of global capitalism either required a lot of legislation, regulation, enforcement, reordering of how money is exchanged, how interest rates, all this stuff that nobody wants to think about.
Yeah, it seems like a real slog, John. I'm kind of backing off it now that you mention it.
Or this dream of a revolution and the creation of a state with equity, both, and a lot of the times they're described as true democracies, one person, one vote democracies, imagining that people will vote their best interests, which we've seen. Even in our contemporary world, people don't vote there.
Doesn't happen.
They don't. And the thing is that leftist ideology requires education and is predicated on the idea that education will enlighten and uplift the masses. And that also...
We're not living in a golden age of education.
Doesn't really seem like it's panning out. What happened to the Baader-Meinhof gang was that as more and more were arrested, the next generation started to mount bank robberies and embassy takeovers and hijackings, but their demands were often that the first generation of Baader-Meinhof guys be released from prison. And
the goals of the organization are currently to get the roles of the organization back in order.
That's right. And
you can't get to global revolution if you're just trying to get
the old guys out of jail. And so that toward the late 70s, they started to fall out of favor. They started to lose their sympathy within the European left, mainstream left, because their demands were no longer these sort of universally agreed upon changes to the structure of the world, and were much more like, we've hijacked this guy and we will kill him if you don't release Andreas Baader from prison.
It's all organizational infighting stuff.
And you saw it in Munich in 72. You see it in Tebbe.
Yeah.
You see it in the Baader-Meinhof gang hijacked a plane to Mogadishu.
Yeah, and the stereotypical version of these, all they want is to get one of their own guys out of prison.
Yeah. And unfortunately, it's a stereotype for a reason. It actually kind of started to pan out that way. And the bank robberies were just to get money to survive, because they're all living underground and they just need money, which is less sympathetic.
Oh, you guys need money now, do you?
And what happened politically in Germany is that the right, and I think in Italy and across Europe, the right did succeed in imposing more restrictions, police state restrictions. But the long-term consequence was, and we talk about this in the United States all the time, that more and more leftist ideas got integrated into the Green Platform, into the left mainstream parties in Germany, so that by the 80s, and then especially into the 90s and now even, although these ruling parties are still very much center and center-right, socialized medicine is seen as a common right.
Right. European right parties don't want to touch socialized medicine.
And there's a lot of socialistic principles that became mainstreamed within European governments that were a product of this period where that sympathy did ultimately, and a lot of the leftist radicals, as they matured, became mainstream left politicians that really did move the needle left. Now that
didn't really happen here.
It didn't happen here, and a large part of it was the Reagan Revolution, even in the UK, where you had a Thatcher revolution, because of a parliamentary system, you still had an active enough left that they needed, that when the Labour Party got into power, they needed to make common cause and adopt policies from a harder left.
But Reagan and Thatcher both pulled their respective opponent parties, opposition parties,
to the
right with them. You get Clinton and Blair as a result of
Reagan and Thatcher. But in the United States, a lot of that, and even the social and social justice stuff in the U.S. got pulled right by economics. The appeal to commodity fetishism, the question, are you better off now than you were 10 years ago? We're going to make America great again. We're going to bring the pride back. And all of that was...
It just means a nicer car.
It means nicer stuff, right? And watching the labor movement in the United States get discredited partly by the decline of our manufacturing power and Reagan's ability to tie the fact that our cars were no good anymore to labor and to organize, and his busting of the air traffic controllers.
You got to keep the new industries that are forming to replace manufacturing, keep them from unionizing, and you never get a real voting bloc there.
That's right. And so the left, and then the discrediting of the word liberal, and connecting that to racist dog whistling. the welfare state, the all this black underclass that doesn't want to work, that whole.
But I assume one reason you can do that is because people remember these guys with long hair and fringe on their jackets blowing stuff up, right? I mean, if you've got memory of that on both sides of the Atlantic, it lets people say, oh, being liberal is unpatriotic.
Right. And in the United States, of course, we have a lot more diversity racially than the European nations, at least until recently. And so that diversity also plays into those arguments.
It gives you a bad guy.
Yeah, it's not just the leftist. We can connect that to the Watts riots. We can connect that to the Rodney King riots because all of it is...
It's a fear that someone is coming for your stuff in violent ways.
Which is, what we have now. The Baader-Meinhof gang dissolved largely after the fall of the Berlin Wall. There wasn't any. They were, I think, throughout the 80s, kind of supported by the Stasi and by the East German governments. Even as East Germany fell apart, they were still trying to.
For a very low investment, they can sow a lot of instability in the West, right? Right.
But that whole sort of geopolitical game all fell apart, and the Baader-Meinhof dissolved and disavowed, the remaining members kind of disavowed violent action.
Have anyone become politicians in the same way these former IRA guys are now elder statesmen? Or?
Some of the sympathetic students of the early 70s did go on to become mainstream politicians, still active today. But a lot of the members of the second and then third generation of Baader-Meinhof are accused of murder.
Yeah.
What happened to Andreas Baader? Unfortunately, Ulrike Meinhof hung herself in prison in 1976 in a hanging that where she had tied the sheets of her bedding together and hung herself in her cell. There was the problem being that finding of suicide was made by the police in the prison, supported by prosecutors who were all ex-Nazis, and there was no kind of independent investigation into her suicide. The imprisoned Baader-Meinhof people of that first generation did hunger striking. They found all manner of sort of method to communicate with each other through their lawyers and to remain in the public eye. But in October of 1977, three of the main the main remaining members of imprisoned Baader-Meinhof gangsters, what am I saying? Members of the gang members, including Andreas Baader, committed suicide having smuggled pistols into the jail through their lawyer. They shot themselves in jail. Yeah.
It doesn't seem like... to me, that seems more suspicious. I guess the lawyer can say, nope, I gave him the pistols.
Sort of.
It seems more suspicious than the hanging.
Pretty suspicious that if you were in solitary confinement where you had no access to anyone, that you would have them smuggle in a pistol.
If I got a gun in jail, I'm not sure if that's what I would do with it.
Wouldn't you try and take a couple of cops out with you? I mean, to just get a pistol to kill yourself.
It's not very Baader-Meinhof-y.
It's really not. And to this day, there's a lot of suspicion that those were extrajudicial killings, and that really put what that did was end hijackings and kidnappings in order to get them released from prison, because they were all dead now. So once the first generation was gone, the second and third generation no longer had that same sort of link to the original righteous organization. So they disappeared for a long time, but in 2016,
what?
There was a failed armored car robbery outside of Bremen where a Ford Focus rolled up on an armored car that was dropping or, making deposits or taking deposits from a local supermarket, blocked in the armored car, and 3 people made an assault on it, where they failed to blow open the armored car, failed to get what would have been over €1 million inside.
Whoa.
And made their escape, but left behind DNA traces, revealing them to be Ernst Staub and Daniela Klette and Burkhard Garwig, 3 Baader-Meinhof third-generation gang members from the late 70s.
Are they in like walkers with tennis balls on the feet? I mean, they would have to be at least in their late 50s, early 60s.
Yeah, they were 58 years old at the time. They're in their early 60s now. So they're only 10 years older than I am. But that means in 1976, they were already, active in the...
Does that make you feel youthful? People your age are out there blowing up armored cars?
A little bit older than me.
That gives you something to look forward to. Your life's not over, John. There could be lots more revolutionary acts in your future.
Well, when I look at the current left and the current state of our fascistic national government, and I try and apply these past lessons and this history to the success of violent action, for one, which seems to be somewhat limited, but the success of the ideological action, and you see the kind of unfortunate story that ideological action only got integrated in this sort of backdoor method where some members of parliament have those sympathies. You really want to do it better this time. And that's not to say that I don't have tons of plastique here in our bunker.
I mean, one thing, maybe this is a side note, but you do have young, energized people getting directly into politics today in their 20s, which I don't know if I remember happening on either side of the Atlantic in the late 60s into the 70s.
It did happen, but as you've mentioned, we're in a 2-party system here. And so your only real power, other than the power of the pulpit, is if you can get a majority. And the difference in a parliament is that if you get a faction, you can then, draw the mainstream to the left. In the United States, the threat of the youth vote being denied to Biden, for instance, is, it is a threat that's being ventured.
Because people, I think, see that cost Clinton the presidency in 2016.
It did, but does anybody? I don't know where your ideology would have to be where you would prefer Trump if you were a leftist, right? You could say all day. I'm speaking as a Nader voter, 2-time Nader voter.
It's always under your name. That's the chyron under your face when you're on TV.
Yeah, Nader voter.
John Roderick, 2-time
Nader voter. It's actually on my business card.
And that concludes the Baader-Meinhof gang. Entry 088.EZ2736, certificate number 26524, in the omnibus. Listeners, even though John and I are critics of late-stage capitalism in all its forms, and consumerism in all its forms, we still do this outro every entry about how you should send us material things. And if possible, support us economically. We're hypocrites, is what I'm saying.
The thing is that having people support us directly with their contribution.
This is the Paris Commune right here.
That's right. It's not at all part of a capitalist superstructure. This is
support this little private economy we have. Support the omnibus cell of the global revolution.
This is your opportunity to be a petit médici and support us with let us do our statuary and our ceiling painting.
Don't be a normal sized Medici. Just be a little tiny one, like that someone can carry in his pocket.
If you want to be a big Medici and give us like a stipend of €1 million,
we want somebody on the right to pay us more than this not to do the show.
€1 million lira,
and we will stop immediately.
How much would it cost for us to stop doing the show and stop putting out our leftist claptrap?
It would take our current Patreon donor base plus $1. But there are multiple ways you could support the show. You can follow us at Omnibus Project or at John Roderick or at Ken Jennings. You can leave favorable reviews of the show. Listen to John's other shows. Why not? Buy my books.
Buy Ken's books.
Participate
and listen,
in the whole omnibus commune economy.
Listen to my podcast Friendly Fire on the Max Fun Network about we watch old war movies and talk about them, full of leftist claptrap.
Don't do this at the cost of Omnibus, but if you have extra time after you've listened to Omnibus, John's got 3 other shows.
Yeah, that's right. And they're all amazing. I mean, not as good as this one because they don't have Ken Jennings on them, but they're still amazing. You
can page through my books while you listen to John's War Movie podcast or his Talking About Stuff podcast or his other Talking About Stuff podcast.
Heard that.
You can chat with your fellow commune members, the Futurelings, on Facebook or Reddit or Discord. You can email us with communiques about what your cell of the Omnibus movement has been getting up to in your home prefecture at theomnibusproject@gmail.com. If you have things you would like to send us, we would love to see your beautiful aesthetic. I'm not really sure who this is, but Mary from Raleigh, North Carolina. There doesn't seem to be any explanatory note beyond. Oh, there is. It just stuck to the envelope. Because there was a green piece of construction paper with glitter, and I was like, if I hold this up to the light, does this have a message?
Oh.
I can't read the signature, but the return address says Mary, and the letter says that they've been recently researching the distant past and has uncovered our document. That's great. They got back in time to us. Oh, they are robot cicadas, apparently. They're really doing the whole kayfabe thing.
Uh-huh.
And she has sent us an heirloom from her aunt or great-aunt Opal, fabric she collected to Hawaii in the distant past, that she has turned into these beautiful pandemic-era masks for us.
Oh, my goodness. Oh, Ken, those are beautiful.
Look at that old Hawaiian fabric.
Oh.
And look how the back is 70s toilet paper cozy.
Oh, and they're really big, too. They're like our size, or at least my size. Would you throw one over there?
Do you have a big head?
I do. I have a big face, and none of the masks seem to work.
Here's one of each color. These are lovely.
Ken, these are wonderful. Oh, wow. These are so amazing.
And they have a little metal piece to conform to your olfactory proboscis. Don't you like when the mask had the little bread tie at the top?
I do. I like it so much.
You can shape it over the bridge of your nose.
I like it so much. And this one with the... Listen, this one with the Hawaiian stuff on it, they actually have a metal... Oh, wow. This Hawaiian one, are you going to wear this? This is a little boogaloo for you, isn't it?
No, I'll wear one of these.
Okay, all right.
You want both of them? Well, I see what you're trying to pull.
I was going to try that, but
you're going to try to trade me for.
No, it's okay.
For 2 of these.
It's all right. These are amazing, and I'll wear each one of these 3 here.
Thank you. We'd like to thank the Unified Conglomeration for the compilation of and Omnibus.
Mm-hmm.
These lovely masks.
They're called the Unified Corporation?
Conglomeration.
Oh, that sounds like a pretty Marxist-Leninist group, right? It's the Situation Internationale.
That's great. Well, if an insect hive does take over the future, they are they're going to be some kind of communitarian society.
Roger.
We also got from Ian, who says he donates at the Sentient Aspen level in Buffalo. He offers us a tour of Buffalo. He talks about his past in the sciences. He's a PhD. He's worked in cancer and infectious disease. Now he does green business. He starts a business salvaging building materials for reuse and still teaches physics and chemistry at a local community college. But his passion is illustration. He sent us these beautiful Prismacolor illustrations of past omnibus entries. And I don't know how you get colors this vivid out of Prismacolor pencil, because I have tried, and I have never seen color this bold. Look at these, John. These are lovely. This one's about backmasking. Here's one from the Pumpkin Pie Show. These are going all the way back.
You're saying look at this, but you're pointing them at yourself.
I'm selfishly trying to enjoy them.
Oh, look at those.
Look at that color palette. Oh, I accidentally kept one in the package. Furries.
This is nice.
The furries one has woodchucks on old-timey bicycles with produce in the basket.
You see the little hands of the little eyeballs of the futurelings taking a look here.
Yeah, each one is like a relic that has been uncovered by some post-human earthling. These are really beautiful.
Oh, these are good. These are nice.
thank you so much, Ian. I guess the bar is very high from these handicrafts we've been receiving, but we'll put photos of these on our Patreon so you can enjoy them. If you would like to contribute to the show financially, you can free the past leaders of our movement. Mm-hmm. That's one goal we all have.
Yep. You don't have to rob a bank or kidnap an industrialist.
Free Lori Laughlin. Or you can support the show financially at patreon.com/Omnibus Project. You'll receive perks like free monthly bonus episode, up to and including chats with John and myself. We were just chatting with a futureling last week who was telling us about his sugar ant problem. And it turns out you and I both have sugar ant problems, so we commiserated with him about his sugar ants. Yeah,
sugar ants are a problem, but he was a fascinating futureling. And very interesting to talk to about his time as a submariner and all of his great adventures. A Naval Academy graduate.
He had real naval adventures before becoming a tech guy.
He did. Now, just another tech guy.
What are you going to do? But it's good to have. You got the stories.
Yeah, that's right. Been around the world.
But now you can actually
seen a million faces, rocked them all.
But now you can afford a Tesla.
That's right. Futurelings. From our vantage point in your distant past, we have no idea how long our civilization survived. We hope and pray that the catastrophe we fear may never come. But if the worst comes soon, this recording, like all our recordings, may have been our final word. But if Providence allows, we hope to be back with you soon for another entry in the Omnibus.